Good afternoon. I'm Mary-Beth Landy from the Federation for Children's Special Needs Recruitment Training and Support Center, otherwise known as RTSC. I am joined today by Cindy Lewis, who is the call center coordinator for the Federation Parent Training and Information Center.
One of them.
One of the call center coordinators. Cindy has been a coworker of mine and a colleague, respected colleague, so I've asked her to join me today to help answer some questions on special education rights and services, with questions that have been submitted and any questions that you might have. Please just submit them as we go along, and we'll try to answer those questions for you. I'm going to let Cindy do a quick introduction of herself and her background.
Okay. Cindy Lewis. I am a retired lawyer. Also spent some time teaching history. And I've been at the Federation for 3 years. Started dabbling in special education law about 6 years ago. And I work with Carol Silva in the call center to try to help parents who call navigate the special education process.
So you've got two of us here today to try and help through this process. Thank you for people who submitted questions ahead of time. We'll be addressing those first, and if you'd like to submit questions as we go along or ask for some clarification, please just type them into your type them on the computer. We will try and address them, and if we don't, we'll address them afterwards. So, Cindy, welcome. Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it, as do our listeners.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So, if you want to, let's begin.
Okay. I'm not able to forward my presentation, but I'll start by just briefly going through the relevant special education laws. I think that, there we go. As most of you already know, I'm sure, we essentially have the Individuals with Disabilities Act, which is our federal law governing special education, and the regulations can be found at 34 CFR Part 30. We also have a Massachusetts special education law, formerly known as Chapter 766, now Chapter 71B, which in general provides more protections for Massachusetts citizens than the federal law does. So that's good for families of kids with special needs in Massachusetts. The Mass regulations are at 603 CMR Part 28. So we have other sources of information when we're trying to figure out applicable law or how to interpret applicable law or regulations. There's case law, and in Massachusetts, we often look either to decisions by the Bureau of Special Ed Appeals, which don't necessarily have legal effect, but can be compelling evidence of a law's intention, as well as advisories issued by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. There are many advisories that we read frequently that, again, they're not necessarily, these don't go through the administrative regulatory process, so they aren't per se legal documents, but again, can be compelling evidence of not just a statutory intent, but also how a court might interpret a regulation or a law that on its face is rather vague. So often, yeah, I think that's enough said about that. Okay.
So let's start with our questions. How to verify or confirm a student isn't making effective progress and what to do next. So effective progress in special education means to make documented growth in the acquisition of knowledge and skills, including a social and emotional, and that is key for anyone working as a surrogate parent or children that have mental health issues, social and emotional issues in school. And it is within the general curriculum or without accommodations according to the chronological and developmental expectations. So the individual education potential of a student, and the key is on that potential of the student, and the learning standards set forth by the Massachusetts curriculum frameworks and the early childhood programs offered by the district are the key things that you're going to be looking at. So Cindy, you want to talk about some tips as far as keeping track of making effective progress?
Sure. I mean, I think that there are several things to think about. The primary one, of course, is trying to ensure that the IEP goals are solid, that they're measurable, that they're clear, and that the team can agree on tools and assessments and measures that will be used to evaluate progress over time. It's very hard to measure progress when goals are vague or not measurable. It's just, so I like to start there. Some other tips, it can be really helpful to have experts weigh in, especially in areas that are very specialized, like language-based learning disabilities. It's important to document progress over time, using kind of, as I said, accurate measures, regular testing tools, save schoolwork, document the kind of support your kid may be getting in producing that work, whether it's tutoring or an aid. In terms of social emotional development, some indications of progress in that field in those areas could be whether the student has any friends, whether the student is engaging in school refusal type activities, whether there are complaints about the student being anxious or not being able to sleep. Student goes to the nurse frequently. Experts weighing in, of course, it can be very important in terms of assessing social emotional progress as well. But it often comes up that, schools often like to say, oh, they're doing fine academically. They're passing their tests, they're handing in their work. But if a child is not making social emotional progress, as Mary-Beth indicated, then that is a big red flag, and it's indicative of lack of effective progress from a legal standpoint.
Mm-hmm. I'd also like to, we talked a little bit about making sure that the goals are measurable. Mm-hmm. I think that many times you'll see on the IEPs and objectives, I sometimes find that when you're questioning whether they're making effective goals, to use benchmarks.
Yes.
The benchmarks are broken down into marking periods. And so it's much easier, and I feel that they're more data-driven.
Absolutely.
So that it may state that in the first marking period, this is what will be accomplished. In the second marking period, this will be accomplished. And it should show some growth within each of those marking periods and what they'll accomplish by the end of the academic year.
Yeah.
And then also in terms of that, be careful on things like, are they saying, are those benchmarks appropriate for the student? For example, you don't want something that's so lowball that it doesn't push the students far enough to their potential. You also don't want those to be so high that the student will never achieve them in that marking period. Yeah. So also the other thing may have to do with prompts from teachers. Mm-hmm. How many times is a teacher going to have to prompt them for each academic goal or social emotional goal? And if you're finding by the end of the year that it's the last benchmark says that the student will be doing it independently, but the student is still needing to have teacher prompts, that's an indication that they haven't met that goal for the year. So you want to be able to really keep an eye on that. Progress reports are really effective data collection for that. When you're getting the progress reports, that you're checking to make sure that the progress reports are showing the growth, that they're very detailed. And feel free to ask for data. If there's supposed to be data collected on a particular goal, that you can review the data to make sure that they are in fact making those benchmarks.
And tie, tie the data back to the benchmarks. And benchmarks can be a beautiful way to assess progress over time. And obviously, if you're finding virtually the same goals in an IEP year over year, then that's kind of that's direct evidence of failure to make progress toward goals. Annual, IEP goals should be annual. They should be achievable within a year. And so we often have parents saying, my child's had the same goals for 3 years. And that's a big red flag. Okay. Anything else on effective progress?
I think we'll probably touch on it again as we go through.
Okay.
So we have a question. If you would just move to the next slide. How to handle extended school year when the school does not have a least restrictive environment for your child. First off, we wanted to talk a little bit about extended school year, particularly the timing of requesting it. Not every student is offered extended school year or determined by the team that is necessary. Now is a tricky time to be trying to talk about it. It really is something that should be approached with the team in the early spring. I think March and April are good times to be bringing it up.
Or even earlier.
Even earlier. Sometimes the teams want to see how the progress is made through the school year, so they might say, let's reconvene at that time. Again, you have the right to reconvene the team to discuss how they're making progress. So we just wanted to make sure, kind of a sub note on that you're discussing it with the team early enough so that there are options available. So least restrictive environment is the gold standard. It's what you're looking for. So if your child is in a school where they do not have a least restrictive environment, they may only be offering extended school year for, let's say, a particular population of students, then they need to find what's appropriate for your student to be able to continue to make progress and to not regress over the summer in the least restrictive environment. So if it's not being offered in your particular school, is it being offered in another school within the district? And possibly they need to go for another school.
Possibly outside the district.
Or outside the district. So that is definitely a key factor with that situation.
It really needs to be worked through the team, and it's not an appropriate response for the district to say we don't have that program. So the needs drive, the services which drive the appropriate ESY setting for a student. So if they say they don't have it, but the team has determined that a child needs a certain kind of ESY program, then they need to find it. The response should be, okay, let's find a school or a nearby district that meets the criteria that we've set out as a team. And there is a Department of Ed advisory that focuses on extended school year. It can be helpful to consult that advisory. It talks about what you can think about when you're trying to produce evidence of either regression or recoupment, failure to be able to relearn. And also districts have to have written policies on ESY as well. So sometimes you can use a district's own policy to make an argument. Look, you're not following your own internal procedures here. So, but Mary-Beth's right. Don't wait until June to start having or even mid-May to start having the ESY conversation. And don't have the conversation with the team and be okay with a response that says, well, we'll just send them to this summer program, but let's not put it in the IEP. That frequently occurs. Say, no, we want this is ESY. It needs to be on the service delivery grid and part of my child's IEP. And but that does happen frequently.
Mm-hmm. But remember, if it's not on the IEP, it doesn't exist.
And you may get it this year, but you won't have stay put rights to be able to argue for it for next year.
And I would also add in the phrase of appropriate services that your student is receiving.
Yeah.
So if you have a student who is delayed in, say, reading,
Mm-hmm.
and say that they're in ninth grade, but they're still at a math or a reading level of, say, a fourth grader, that the extended school year program that they're going into is one that can teach them at their grade level,
Yeah.
where they're at,
Yeah.
and not necessarily be dealing with, say, algebra if the student has
Yeah.
never touched algebra before, because again, it's so that they do not regress significantly from what they've learned during the year.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily an issue of acquiring new knowledge, but the regression point.
Yeah.
So it needs to be appropriate for the child, for that specific child.
Yeah.
Again, we're always talking, it's an individual education
Yeah.
plan, so it has to be for that specific
Yeah,
child.
especially kids with language-based learning disabilities
Exactly.
who really, you do want them to have interventions that are appropriate for whatever the deficit is. Whether it's whether it's a double deficit or a phonological awareness deficit. So you don't want them to just be thrown into a program that's not meeting the identified needs.
Correct. And it shouldn't be a program where your child is coming home saying, we watch videos all day, or it's not a babysitting service. It's not to be used as that. It is certainly not the expectation. It is still academics during the
Right.
school year, and social emotional as well.
Yeah.
I would also add in to make sure that the appropriate staff member is available to offer those services.
Yes. And, town recreation programs don't meet the requirements for ESY.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so we have a question. Is having a neuro-psych or neuropsychological evaluation done through a family's PCP or pediatrician recommended in order to access optimal services? I want to talk a little bit about the neuropsychological evaluations to start with. I'm not quite sure where the question was going, but first off, a pediatrician could not do a neuropsychological evaluation, so they could certainly put in a recommendation for one. The schools do not normally do neuropsychological evaluations because they don't have the staff on hand in order to do that. A neuropsychological evaluation must be done by a neuropsychologist. And very rarely, I think, would you find a school district that has one. They may, in fact, outsource it and work with a private evaluator who could do that. It needs to be a licensed or a clinical school psychologist with a doctorate degree who has completed a 2-year fellowship in neuropsychological evaluations. So your school counselor who has their MSW would certainly not be qualified to do a neuropsychological. So you're looking for an outside independent evaluation to be done to start with.
Yeah.
There are a variety of different neuropsychological organizations and services that are available privately. So definitely you're looking at a private evaluation, which also means that you're looking at private pay. Insurances do sometimes pay for a portion of it. You can have that conversation with the company or associates that you contact about it, about how much the insurance will pay. They will only pay for a portion of it because they won't pay for the educational portion of the evaluation. So yes, many times you can get additional services through having a solid neuropsychological evaluation.
Yeah.
And if you would like more questions about that, we have recently done 2 webinars by Kevin Domingos, who can explain during the differences in the neuropsychological and the benefits of having one. He does talk a little bit about insurance and also private pay. The evaluations are expensive. If you are a surrogate parent, a special education surrogate parent, please be aware that a neuropsychological evaluation is not within your realm to authorize. That must be authorized through the Department of Children and Families social worker, because it's considered a medical evaluation. And as you recall, you don't have medical decision making. You can certainly have a good collaborative conversation with the social worker to help them to understand why it would be beneficial to have the student have a neuropsychological. You can have them done through the hospitals. Again, that's why it's a medical decision. There's a long waiting list to have them done. So sometimes the private agencies are more likely to be able to conduct them. You're also more likely to be able to get the neuropsychologist to attend a meeting. The evaluations are really looking at the whole child, and you'll gather a lot more information through a neuropsychological because they just spend more time with the student. So if you can get them, great. I would love to say, yes, everyone go out and get one for a child, particularly children with trauma. It is beneficial to have one, but it is tricky to get one. So if you're looking at it for a client or your own child, you certainly can consider doing one. You can contact the call center. They do have a list of neuropsychologists in the database that they can provide you with some names, at least something that you can start. You can Google some organizations. You can certainly go back to our webinar, look on the information for Kevin's organization, and check out Boston Neurological Associates. NESCA in Newton also does fabulous evaluations, but there are plenty of great neuropsychologists out there to do them. So it depends on where you were looking for with that question. I hope that that's answered it. Anything you'd like to add?
Well, I think that, I think that sometimes there's very good clinical information on a student, but the education piece, so how the clinical piece, the social emotional piece and the clinical piece kind of affect learning can be complicated.
Yes.
Is it that the student isn't available for learning because of anxiety and all of the emotional challenges, or is there an underlying learning disability? And sometimes for a lot of these kids, it really hasn't been teased out. And there's sort of no one document that sets it all out nicely, because it can be tricky, especially if your students are doing well on the clinical side, on the social emotional side, and they're really starting to be available to learn, right? And then you're saying, well, actually, I'm not quite sure how my student does learn, and there's often just a lot of missing information.
Yes.
So that's where it can be really helpful. One document, one PhD neuropsychologist putting it together and making very concrete recommendations on the learning side.
Absolutely. And any neuropsychological evaluation you have should have very concrete recommendations, and they will normally sit down with you prior to completing the report for their evaluation, and to review it with you so that you have an understanding as far as exactly what it's saying. So,
all right. I think that's enough on that topic for now, huh?
Yes. So, can a parent become a special education surrogate parent for their own child? I think the question that I have here is trying to understand for their own child. If your child is in your own custody, so not in the custody of the Department of Children and Family, then you would not need a special education surrogate parent. You would actually, if you wanted the assistance, you would have an advocate or a parent consultant working with you. Special education surrogate parents are very particular role that's appointed by the state to serve as the educational parent for children who do not have a parent or guardian to be able to make those decisions for them. So if your child happens to be in DCF custody and in the care and protection of the state, then the answer would unfortunately still be no. They would be appointed an independent surrogate parent to serve as that position. So I hope that answered that question, because I'm not sure which direction you were going with. But if you are looking for an advocate or a parent consultant to help you for your own child, I would recommend calling the call center and having a conversation with them about what your needs are for having an advocate. And that's when Cindy or Carol can help you find an advocate that would be appropriate.
Yeah, it kind of depends on whether the parent has custody or not, because if the parent doesn't have custody, then the parent doesn't have at that time educational decision-making powers. So in those cases, a surrogate parent is generally assigned. And and that person, for whatever period of time the child is in DCF custody, has that decision-making role for the student. But we weren't clear exactly about that question, but we hope we've answered it.
Okay, so let's switch the slide for me.
Okay.
No, the slide. There we go. How can I be sure that the school follows the IEP? I have come across many situations that school doesn't do it and I can't prove it. The trick on this, or the key to this, is documentation. If you have good measurable goals, there should be documentation that is taking place. And gathering that documentation is key. You have the right to ask for the documentation. Sometimes that can be a little bit of a challenge to get the documentation, but it depends on what you're asking for, is what situation it is that they are not following the IEP. Is it that they're not providing the services in the number of times or the number of minutes per week that they're supposed to be doing so? Is it that, for example, the physical therapist is on maternity leave and they haven't placed the substitute in that place to provide those services? Then those are conversations you want to be having with the special ed director of the school or the district, is to find out what they're going to do to provide those services or compensate you for the lost services. That is something that you can certainly talk to them about, is compensatory services, if that turns out to be the situation.
One of the things that I always recommend to parents is that they just create a Word document and that they keep track of concerns that arise on a day-to-day basis. They may be exactly about IEP compliance, or they may just be concerns about what's going on at school. You know, I got a call from the teacher about this or that, and that it's just a running document. Then you just, you put the date in, you can just open it up, put the date in and say, my son came home from school today and told me this. And so I think sometimes it's so helpful to keep track in real time, more or less, of concerns. And then, you may periodically or more frequently either send an email, and you can decide who the people should be, who the addressees should be, that outlines concerns. They may be, again, concerns about compliance as well as other things. And you're kind of riding herd on the school. You're saying, look, you're supposed to be doing these things. I'm concerned that you may not be. And if it gets to be compelling enough, you request a team meeting. But I think that oftentimes there's a lot of back and forth conversation, and that's fine, except that all of that should be documented.
Yes.
And then if at some point you need to file a complaint with PRS, you have all of your evidence and all of your concerns right there before you, and it's very helpful because it's hard to remember. But I also agree with Mary-Beth. You know, if you have concerns about whether specific services are being delivered, you can ask for assurances that in fact they are, with the person they're supposed to be, who's supposed to be conducting them, and in accordance with whatever frequency is laid out on the service delivery grid.
Absolutely. Again, I cannot stress documentation.
Yeah.
Because when you do proceed to a complaint, or even if you had to go to hearing, it is all about documentation. So you want to make sure that you're gathering that as you go along. Students can be good referrals to what happened in your day. Did you see? So you want to be checking in with your student. Did you meet with the occupational therapist today, as you were supposed to?
Yep.
Given some flexibility that maybe their schedule, they were out sick today. Missing at one time occasionally is a different story than having a situation where they're really not receiving the services. And you can certainly bring that up too. If they're not receiving a specific service and they're not following the IEP, then they're probably not making progressive progress. So you would definitely be able to tie that in again with their progress reports, and whatever notes that the teacher is providing during those progress reports. I would also, if there's an issue where you feel that they're not meeting the needs of the student, say through accommodations, I would hold a team meeting and reconvene a team meeting to discuss that. One of the tricks that possibly as older students can do is make sure that they understand what the accommodations are that they should be receiving, so that they can ask for those services and make sure that they are receiving those services. Even to go as far as having a situation where I know of a child who photocopied and laminated their accommodations.
Nice.
And would carry them around for them. So if they had a substitute teacher, they could say, I have time and a half to be able to take my tests, because here's a copy of my accommodations. So that was a clever special ed
That's a great idea.
person who helped out with that one. So so hopefully that has answered that question.
Okay. All right. Okay, what are the requirements for draft IEPs and requesting a copy prior to the meeting? So if you look at the applicable law, you'll see that the laws, I think both the federal law in Massachusetts, but don't quote me on that, will say that the IEP needs to be provided immediately after the meeting. So I will say sort of, first of all, that requesting a copy prior to the meeting is not something you would want to do, because the goal of the IEP process is to ensure involvement by the team, including the parent or surrogate parent, as the case may be. So a document that's developed without that input, in my opinion, that doesn't reflect the conversation at the team meeting, whether it's an annual meeting or especially if it's an initial meeting for eligibility. You don't want that draft until you've had an opportunity to provide input and until there's been a discussion. Now, oftentimes in a surrogate parent context, you often will have a draft for discussion, or it might be or it might just be the, you know, you're working from the existing IEP.
Mm-hmm.
But the law essentially contemplates that there's a discussion at the meeting, and then as long as the team leader provides a summary of that meeting, which includes goals, proposed goals, and a proposed service delivery grid, then the team generally, or the district generally, has to produce a draft IEP for the parents' review within 2 calendar weeks. And that whole process is laid out in a Department of Ed advisory,
Mm-hmm.
Massachusetts Department of Ed advisory. And essentially they created the advisory because they really didn't want there to be team meetings where the parents were kind of given an IEP and said, sign this,
Mm-hmm.
right? Sign this. This is going to provide for all of your child's needs. And so that was problematic, but they weren't going to amend the statute. So DESE has kind of developed this advisory, I think it's from 2006, that says, so this is a process based on how things actually play out that we think is workable. And parents or surrogate parents always have the option, if they don't want to wait 2 weeks, to request it sooner, in which case the district needs to provide the draft IEP within 3 to 5 days. So, so you can, you know, I think it's really important that, you know, and I mean, you can provide input into a draft IEP and still look at a draft IEP at the meeting, but it doesn't. But if that doesn't work for you, mm-hmm. you can definitely push back.
Right. I mean, if it's, sometimes schools think that they're being helpful and saving time in the meeting by writing a draft IEP, and it should say draft across it, mm-hmm. And be able to provide it to you, provide it at the team meeting. The requirements are that they actually provide it to you before the team meeting so that you have a chance to look it over. I do think it's somewhat of a putting the cart before the horse, because they don't know what your parental concerns are, which can totally change everything that they're thinking about, or there's a lot of amendments that would have to take place, amendment to the IEP that they've constructed. I think the other issue is that many times if schools have written a draft IEP and try and present it to you at the meeting, they don't let you take the IEP with you.
Right.
So definitely I say write notes on another piece of paper. Don't write it on the draft IEP, because then you don't have the notes to take with you when you do get the IEP in the mail. And you want to be able to confer what was talked about in the meeting as well as what you had written down. So that is a suggestion. If they do provide you with a draft IEP, you know, again, I would agree with Cindy, push back and say, we're going to start from square one, and I'm going to talk about my concerns and the vision, and where I would like to see my child, where my child would like to see themselves. And these are their strengths, because children change so quickly that, you know, getting input from everybody, but getting input from parents is primary. It is the first, you know, concept in special education law, is the parents' participation. So I think to have a draft IEP where parents were not part of it, the drafting of it, is not appropriate. So.
And I just think it's more helpful to be able, if you're going to look at a document and it's a child who's already on an IEP, I'd rather look at, well, what have we been working from? Mm-hmm. And as a team, go through the existing IEP to identify things that have changed, or to ask questions about, oh, that goal, geez, we've had it for a couple of years now. Or so it's as opposed to sort of trying to jump to the next step. And then you can have a concrete discussion about, well, how should this goal change? Oh, this is what's on it, you know, and this is what the, you know, recent testing showed. And you kind of work with the new information and pivot from the old document to work toward development of the new one.
Right.
Okay.
So what do you do when testing request is denied? Well, that's a very simple one.
Yeah.
They're not allowed to deny it, so we can begin with that. But it depends on the stage that you're at. If you are asking for initial evaluations, the school is not allowed to deny. They are not allowed to push it off or say, oh, I think it would be better if we tested them at a different time. If you are requesting an evaluation, initial evaluation for the student, and you have been denied, I've listed the program resolution systems, which is used to be referred to as program quality assurance. So if the name has changed, the number has not, and the service has not changed. You would call and ask to speak to the person in charge of the district where your child is, and have a conversation with them. It may require filing a complaint against the district because they're denying the testing. If you're looking for testing, let us say that you've had the educational psychological testing in the last, within the previous year, you would have to have really good concrete reasons as to why you would want to have the testing again. If you disagree with the testing, you would really be looking for an independent education evaluation or an independent evaluation. The school would not redo the testing. There are specific rules about how often students can be tested. They can't be tested with the same test twice within a year because they'll become familiar with the test and therefore it will skew their responses. So if you're being denied a request because you're asking for the student to be retested because you disagree with it, it's a different procedure than the school's not going to do the retesting. So they're okay with denying it, but they should be offering you the option of having an independent education evaluation done, which is done by a third party. The school would pay for the testing to be done, but the testing is done by someone who takes state rates. Or will negotiate state rates with the school. And they usually have a list of providers in your area that will take state rates. If not, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, or DESE, also has a list of them that you could do that. And we do at the call center have some evaluators who will take state rates depending on what the evaluation is that you're looking for.
Go ahead.
Again, you really have to have concrete reasons and document to the school. In fact, if you were going to get an independent education evaluation, you would do that through writing. You want to make sure that if the school has denied you testing that you requested, that you get that in writing from the school, for example, why they're denying it. So even if you've had that conversation and it's been a phone conversation, I always recommend you follow up with an email saying, as per our conversation, I want to just be clear, this is what you said to me over the phone. Again, emails are documentations. They date stamp and time stamp it, and follow up with them as far as exactly why, because it will give you more leverage when you're looking for another evaluation.
Okay. Yeah, this is a broad question, but Mary-Beth's done a good job of, there's where you can look at it three ways. One would be an initial evaluation, which they're absolutely not legally allowed to deny. The second would be within 16 months of an evaluation, requesting an independent evaluation. Again, that often happens if there's just a disagreement between the team and the parent as to what the IEP should look like or whether there should be eligibility at all. So that's a different animal. And then a third case may be when a parent or surrogate parent, in this case, may want to request a repeat evaluation within the 3-year period. So students, as you probably know, are generally evaluated in 3-year cycles. So sometimes it's sometimes you want the school to reevaluate before that 3-year mark. And the best argument to make for that to happen is to say, things have really changed.
Mm-hmm.
My child is in crisis. You know, there's a lot going on. Often this happens with mental health issues and, or emotional disabilities. You know, a teenager just stops going to school, can't get out of bed for depression or whatever it is. You're saying, look, circumstances have significantly changed. I'd like to get my child or my surrogate child reevaluated as soon as possible, as opposed to waiting another year for an evaluation. So.
Or the other thing I was just remembering as well is that should the school have done a particular evaluation and they didn't do it,
Mm-hmm.
you do have the right to ask them to go ahead and do it, and they
Yes.
can't deny that. For example,
Yes.
we at RTSC recommend that you get a speech and language evaluation done for social pragmatic skills.
Absolutely.
On a regular basis. So if the school didn't do it because you're saying, oh, he doesn't have any articulation issues, and refused to do it, you have a case that, in that case, to have them go through and do the evaluation. They shouldn't deny it. So again, that may be there may be more to this question. You certainly
Mm-hmm.
can follow up with us and
Yeah.
find out some more details. We can answer it a little bit more specifically if that's the case. So
Sounds good. Okay. All righty. Moving through our questions.
the stay put rights.
Stay put right for kids in foster care. Please explain stay put rights for kids in foster care placed in group homes as they move through different levels of care. Why don't you start with the movement through levels of care piece of it?
So it really does depend on what again, this is another question we're going to try and answer in a variety of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
So students that are placed in group homes would be assigned to have a surrogate parent because they're not in a foster care placement or a pre-adoptive placement. So they don't have foster parents making those educational decisions for them. There are occasional times when a student is in a group home facility that is not meeting their needs as far as the group home is concerned and their social and emotional is concerned. So they may find that they need to put them in a different level of care in a, say, residential placement as opposed to a group home, which is slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
Then that gets a little tricky as far as the school placement, because if they're going to a residential placement, usually it is also a residential school.
Yeah.
Some of those schools require that the student attend school on campus, and that may be a change in educational placement for them.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we talk about this with surrogate parents as part of the training. You have the decision-making rights for educational placement, but stay put rights do not apply to placement, educational placement. They apply to the IEP, and that's one of the reasons why we also talk in training about making sure that the IEP is appropriate in a variety of educational settings, because students in the foster care system do have a tendency to change placement more often than we would like to see a lot of times. There's also the issue that DCF has the final say in where they are placed for their residents. So sometimes that supersedes what might have been a great placement for them educationally. If let's say they are in Boston, in a group home in Boston, and they are not succeeding in the group home and they need to go to a residential placement in Fitchburg, they are not going to be able to stay in their school of origin in Boston because the travel time is just exceeds the 1 hour travel time. So they may end up going to school in the Fitchburg area. If it's a certain residential placement, they may have to attend school at the residential placement, or you may be looking for a different placement somewhere within an hour radius of Fitchburg. So it can get a little bit complicated. But again, as we talked about, stay put rights as far as school placement are not available. It is stay put rights on the services that are being provided on the IEP, not on the placement.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people don't understand that your stay put applies to a type of placement. And even in this case, that can get murky because the type may need to change depending on where the child is in terms of the hierarchy of care. But in general, it's not a specific school that stay put guarantees. So for example, if a child gets kicked out of a school, that's allowed. The school is allowed to kick them out, and the parent or the surrogate parent doesn't have a right to say, I'm invoking my stay put. It doesn't violate stay put, and essentially whether or not another school is a good placement for that child really needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and ideally in the context of a team meeting. The team should be working together if DCF's at the table, if it's a surrogate parent thing. And I was just at a meeting where we had a really complicated conversation about, this is what this student really wants at age 16, and the DCF worker wanted something, and I was thinking, I'm not sure she's ready for that, and we really had to work it out, and we did. But that it's best when the clinician, everybody's weighing in on how to move forward, because the DCF placement needs to change. So but anyway, that's the long answer to that question.
And I would also encourage, we have talked about best interest determination meetings for when a student is residential placement is going to change. Surrogate parents can be involved in those meetings. Having a great relationship with the DCF worker and working collaboratively with everybody really does make a difference in how much you are informed of these things, and how much say that you have as far as these are concerned.
So true.
Remember, collaboration, you get more with honey. So
yes, you're so right. It's like you want them to like you, so they'll listen to you.
If you move the slide for me.
Okay, I think this next one can be very short.
Yep. As an education coordinator or IEP coordinator stated that it is she who makes all the IEP decisions and writes what she wants in the IEP. Is that correct? The quick answer is no. Again, this comes back to who is on the IEP team. It is a team decision, and parents, whether it is your student or you are the surrogate parent, you are a primary part of that team. So it is not the decision of the IEP coordinator as far as what happens. And I would say this would definitely feel free to call the call center if this is a situation that's going on. Feel free to call me, where we can have a conversation about exactly what's happening, what it is that they're putting in the IEP that you're disagreeing with, particularly since the IEP coordinator or IEP team leader is not necessarily someone who works directly with the student.
Right.
So, the teachers know.
But there are some team leaders who do take that attitude, who do feel that it's their role to dictate the terms of the IEP, which is too bad because it completely stifles the team process, and it means a lot of people around the table often don't feel they can express their views because it's a view that the team leader doesn't agree with. So this is this is not an uncommon dynamic, I think. But at the end of the day, the team leader needs to understand that the parent has to agree with the IEP, and that the parent can reject all or part of the IEP. And so but there are some people who are a little power hungry. Okay. All right. We're moving along because we see that we're running out of time. Okay. Okay, yep, I'm falling down on the job here. What's the best way to keep the process moving forward when relocating to a different school system within Massachusetts? We get a lot of calls about parents who are moving or hoping to move. And I won't go into all of the details of it, but essentially you need to move and enroll your child so that you can then have a conversation with the school. They'll say, if you're thinking of a town and you call that town's special education director and say, I really want to sit and talk to you about what my child's IEP would look like, the SPED director will say, I would be happy to talk with you once you've enrolled your child. So move to the town, enroll your child, contact the SPED director, and request a preliminary meeting. Because what you need to do is you need to meet with them, get that IEP implemented. You know, you're going to be developing a new team, and they're likely going to want to do their own evaluation and come up with their own IEP. But in the meantime, that new district is obligated to follow the terms of the existing IEP.
And the same is true for a child in DCF custody who's being moved. And that's why we talk about having an IEP that is written for the appropriate educational services, but without such specifics that the services would not play out in a different setting. So again, DCF is required to do the enrollment immediately. And then the student is enrolled. Usually the team wants to see the student perform for a little while before they're going to reconvene, but you'll have another meeting for at the new school for the student.
Yeah.
Okay.
MCAS options for students with disabilities. I mean, we could have a long conversation about MCAS. And now it's MCAS 2, which is 2. Second revision. So
I will just add that we did do a webinar a couple of months ago regarding the MCAS.
Okay.
So if we don't get to your answer we don't get to what you're looking for in this, I highly recommend that you take a look at that webinar as well.
Yes. We'll quickly say students with disabilities are required to pass the MCAS to get a diploma. And then students who don't, of course, are generally on IEPs until they do, or until age 22. Options. So students who can't pass the MCAS may use the MCAS alt. Now that should be a team decision. There are very, very, very few students who actually use MCAS alt, and even fewer who are able to get a diploma as a result of passing MCAS alt. So it's not actually a practical alternative for most students, I would say. So to get a diploma under the new MCAS version 2, a student has to meet or exceed expectations. That's the threshold on math and ELA. Or they can partially meet expectations / need improvement, plus complete what's called an education proficiency plan, and also, this is complicated, and also score a needs improvement on one of the high school STEM tests. That's, what's that S part stand for? Science, technology, and engineering and math. Yeah. And of course, the student also has to meet local graduation requirements. Did they take all the courses that are required to graduate? Did they get enough credits? So schools try very hard to give kids diplomas, even when they arguably haven't met the criteria of their own, or they bend over backwards to get them to sort of meet, they want to be able to argue that, they've done fine on their MCAS, because the schools don't want to be responsible for kids beyond, 18 if they can pull it off. So the student who struggles to pass can retake the MCAS for either math or ELA beyond 10th grade. They can complete the EPP, the Educational Proficiency Plan. After 3 times of retesting, they can actually request an MCAS appeal based on their academic work or on their grades. So there is an appeal process. I really don't know how many kids try to take advantage of that. You know, many parents want kids to stay in the system. So passing the MCAS isn't always, it varies from family to family, depending on, you know, where is your child, and is your child possibly, you know, is your child focused on college, and is that the path that, you know, a realistic path? And if that's the case, you know, kids are eager to pass and get out of high school. So it really plays out differently for different kids and different families.
So it looks like we have come to the end of our time. We have not necessarily gotten to all the questions. So what I would like to do is to send out, type out the responses to the questions, answer those, and send them out to the people who have come through and registered for the webinar, and address any questions that were submitted during the webinar. Again, I thank you for joining us this afternoon. Cindy, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary-Beth.
I appreciate you stepping away
and
from
watchers.
taking your time from the call center to come in and join us.
Happy to do it.
I do want to just mention, that if you're looking for some additional supports, you can contact us. I would like to ask you to save the date. Our Special Education Surrogate Parent Program annual conference. It's our 7th annual. Making the Difference is on November 27th. It is in Marble, as usual, and it is an excellent conference. You will have trouble choosing all the great workshops which one to attend. So please mark that in your calendars now, so you don't forget. I would also like to just quickly share that the Division of Insurance for the state of Massachusetts is having a listening session for families regarding the Children Mental Health Campaign. It is next Wednesday from 10 to 12. It allows families to come talk about how private insurance companies should be offering the in-home services that Mass Health people can be eligible for through the CBHI services. So it's important to be hearing from families at this point. Thank you for joining us today. If you have any further questions, please feel free to contact me at RTSC at fcsn.org. And we appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you and have a good day.
Yes.